All right, good afternoon and welcome. My name is Daniel Sargent, and I'm a co-director of the Institute of International Studies. Because I'm on the panel, I'm not going to give an introduction right now. I just want to welcome you on behalf of the Institute and offer a couple of acknowledgments. I would like to extend sort of my gratitude, our gratitude, to Linda Meyerson at the Institute for all of the hard work she's done to put this event together. And I would also like to acknowledge the Institute of Governmental Studies, which is our co-sponsor for this event. I think all that remains now for me to do is to introduce my colleague and friend, Tom Laqueur, who is going to be chairing today's panel for us. Tom, over to you.
Thank you. So I'm Tom Laqueur. I was for many years a member of the history department and a colleague of Daniel's. So here's what's going to happen. We're going to hear first from John Shattuck for a little more than 10 minutes, and then from each of our three panelists, and then they can speak amongst themselves for a couple of minutes for your benefit, and then we'll have a more open discussion. So the occasion for this event is the publication of John Shattuck, Shuma Rahman, and Matthias Rissa's book, Holding Together, the Hijacking of Rights in America and How to Reclaim Them for Everyone. John Shattuck is almost ridiculously qualified to discuss these topics. He has been in higher education, president and director of the Central European University, vice president of Harvard. More to the point on rights, he was assistant secretary of state for democracy, human rights and labor under Bill Clinton. And more to the point, recently he has been in the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at Harvard, and also at Tufts University, where he holds an international seminar with students in Europe. And so he guided, or was part of guiding, the research that produced this quite wonderful book. So I also want to welcome Ellen Hume, his wife, who came with him, who's a quite distinguished journalist, used to be the Wall Street Journal correspondent for the Wall Street Journal and for national correspondent for the Los Angeles Times, and I will hope have things to say on this subject. So, if in a way John Shattuck represents the how to put it, the prefrontal cortex of thinking about rights, Arlie Hochschild represents the amygdala. That is to say, she's a sociologist, if you will, of the emotions and of the emotions in politics. Her most famous recent book is Strangers in Their Own Land, Anger and Mourning on the American Right, which was a finalist for the National Book Award. And is a book that tries to explain the connections between the kinds of issues discussed in here, which we seem to always we all agree on, or 80-some% agree on almost everything, and why it doesn't quite work out that way in real life. And I think that's why I say it has to do with the amygdala. Our next panelist is Cecilia Mo, the Judith and Gruber Associate Professor in Political Science, who works specifically on these kinds of issues, behavioral political economy, and challenges the development of morals and politics today. I might just want to give a shout out for a talk she's giving next week, which sort of speaks to her qualifications to speak here. It's at the Center for Research on Social Change, and begins with the premise: the health and strength of a democratic polity rests upon the public possession of sufficient levels of trust in government, political efficacy, civic engagement, and tolerance, which is the subject of this book. And she does quantitative kinds of research, genetic matching and regression, to study in ways in which this doesn't quite work out in the way we think. And finally, my colleague Daniel Sargent, who you've met briefly, is a joint member of the history department and the Goldman School of Public Policy, where he's just founded with Janet Napolitano a new course on security issues broadly conceived. He works on United States foreign policy His book's about the 1970s, but now he's writing a much broader general history of American foreign policy in which questions of rights play a central part. So again, we're going to begin with John Shattuck's presentation of his book, and then our three panelists, and then you guys. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you very much, and thank you so much for the invitation here, Daniel, and the Institute of International Studies. Linda, thank you for all your very wonderful work in the Institute and the way in which you've made our visit, particularly pleasant in every way. So let me give you a very brief introduction to this probably overly positive book. Rarely do you have somebody stand up before you and say, I'm going to present so positive a perspective that everybody can attack it. And that's, of course, what an academic program should be all about, to say nothing of real life. So, but in all seriousness, let me say that I invite you, all of us, to step back from our daily preoccupation with all the disasters that are occurring, particularly in Washington, the political crises of the debt ceiling, extremists in Congress, Trump's campaign, Biden's documents, et cetera, and take a longer range look at what I hope are the values that have held, and I think could hold, our country together. Now, what are those values? We know that the U.S. is a nation of unprecedented diversity. No other nation in the world is as diverse as this one. It's built not on ancestry, as many countries are, but on waves of immigration from all over the world. Not on blood ties and connections of families, but on the legacy of slavery and the subjugation of indigenous people. These are the building blocks of our country. Now, over the centuries, because of this, we have been a land of both exploitation and opportunity. And most Americans have wanted to believe that, as the Declaration of Independence says, all people are created equal and have rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They want to believe that. This is something we want to believe. This belief, of course, is far from reality for all of us, and certainly very far from reality for many of us. But it has held the country together through revolution and war, through boom times and depression. There have been endless struggles over the centuries, punctuated by violence, racism, bloodshed, civil war, segregation. But throughout it all, and this is what we need to keep our eyes on the prize, as we would say, throughout it, there have been heroic movements of the people for their rights. The right to vote, to equal protection and equal opportunity, freedom of speech and religion, individual dignity and autonomy, due process of law, and a democratic form of government. Those are the hopes and beliefs that we have. And in fact, I would argue that throughout American history, and my historian friends can check me on this, the struggle for equal rights has in fact defined what it is to be American. Now, what our book does is to take a look at what Americans think today about these values, their rights. And to find out, we conducted a series of town hall meetings and national polls. We did this in 2020 and 21 during and before the pandemic. The polls were conducted by the very best polling organization. Cecilia can check me on this. For nonpartisan polling, which is the National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago. And the results, maybe they're misleading, but they were remarkable and surprising. 80% across the political spectrum said that without our rights as our values, America is nothing. Nothing. We don't have a country. They said rights today are not secure, hardly surprising, we all know that. And they said that Americans have more in common than many people think, 80%. Now, these findings, of course, are at odds with the polarization and everything that we see all around us of political conflict, to be sure. But when you dig into the polls, they suggest at least the possibility of bridging divisions by focusing, at least at a general level, on the idea of shared values as rights. A majority believes, and we have data to demonstrate this, that rights include responsibilities to respect the rights of others. 8 out of 10 agree that personal freedom can be balanced against a responsibility to keep people safe in a pandemic. 7 out of 10 agree that the police can be held accountable for actions that violate civil rights while also being responsible for protecting public safety. And 7 out of 10 agree that the right to vote can include automatic registration to vote because citizens have a right and a responsibility to vote. A majority of Americans reject the culture wars that are being fought at the political extremes because they don't live at the extremes. They live across the broad center. 72% say they're fed up with polarization and that politicians are intentionally dividing our country. Hardly a surprise, but maybe a surprise that they're fed up with polarization. The distrust of politicians runs very deep and has convinced people that their rights are not secure. On the other hand, the polls show that the pandemic caused a majority of Americans to have more, not less, respect for others who are different from themselves, even as their trust in politicians hit rock bottom. 75% said that events of the last 2 years have made me think more positively toward Americans of different races or ethnicities than mine, and 73% said that racial diversity makes our country stronger. So the bottom line is that there are about 70% of Americans today who have an expansive view of rights as common values. Now, the problem with this, politically, is that this majority is demographically and politically diverse. Democrats, independents, many Republicans, they have a shared commitment to rights as values, despite disagreements on the extent of specific rights in areas like religion or race or guns or abortion. But the diversity of this cross-partisan majority keeps it from being politically cohesive, and it is rather silent. We may remember the silent majority. This is a new silent majority, but one that's silent on the very values that they seem to want to pursue. And it's overshadowed by a highly partisan minority that rejects the idea of shared values and is actively working to divide the country. This minority is motivated by fear of equal rights as a threat to their racial, religious, cultural, and political identity. Now, as Arlie has so eloquently argued, they are motivated not only by fear of being displaced, but also by fear of being shamed by the majority and by anger at the elites who are promoting equal rights. And the goal of the anti-equal rights minority has been to gain power by overturning elections, as we know, spreading false claims of election fraud, restricting the right to vote, and instigating violence. This active minority is comprised of 4 groups. The leaders, we know who they are, political entrepreneurs who promote lies and grievances to aggrandize their power, destroy their enemies, and keep their followers in line. The organizers and supporters, in many ways the most interesting of the 4 groups, who were stirred up by the leaders to attack equal rights as a threat to their dominance, voting rights as a threat to their demographic dominance, racial equality is a threat to their racial dominance, women's rights and LGBTQ rights as a threat to their cultural and religious dominance. The 3rd group are extremist media and social media that spread fear and disinformation. And the 4th group, you may not guess it, but I will tell you, to give you a sense of who they are in some ways the most dangerous because they're in the federal courts, especially the Supreme Court, having been appointed by a president who twice lost the majority vote, where they've been rolling back equal rights that a majority of Americans want to see protected. So this is the landscape that we have in our country today. People do care about values, but it's not everyone, it's just a majority. And the anti-equal rights minority is working above all to suppress voting rights. Over the last 2 years, 19 states have enacted 35 new laws that make it harder to vote. But a majority of Americans want to strengthen, not weaken, the right to vote. 87%, including 80% of Republicans, favor national standards to protect the electoral process. We know the rights of women are under severe attack. The Supreme Court has overturned the constitutional rights of women to make decisions about their personal lives. This is completely out of step with public opinion. Between 65 and 70%, including about 50% of Republicans, disagree with the court's decision reversing Roe v. Wade. And on issues of racial justice, the courts are undermining the enforcement of civil rights laws, making it more difficult to challenge systemic racial discrimination. But 81%, including 64% of Republicans, agree that the laws against racial discrimination should be strengthened, not weakened. At the same time, discrimination against LGBTQ people has increased as a result of the culture wars being waged by the anti-equal rights minority. But 76%, including 64% of Republicans, believe that people should be protected against discrimination because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. So the polls, whatever they may mean, are clearly out of step with the reality of what's happening politically. Now, there are three possible future directions, and I'll be very brief and then sit down and allow others to comment on this. Three possible future directions of these attacks against equal rights. Despite the differences in size between the equal rights majority, about 70%, and the anti-equal rights minority, about 30%, it's possible that the promise of equal rights could be destroyed in the years ahead. This could happen under two possible scenarios. First, the minority could escalate political violence to destabilize the country. This might play out in the developments around the 2024 elections and actions over the next 2 years by extremist political leaders as they work to dominate the Republican Party and expand their base. On the other hand, another insurrection, if it were to occur, which might be worse than the first since the country is certainly awash in weapons, mass shootings have risen, lies and disinformation are easier to spread. The country may be better prepared to contain political violence than it was 2 years ago after the January 6th, or before the January 6th attack on the Capitol. The second scenario is that the anti-equal rights minority could step up its efforts to seize power by undermining democratic institutions. This is what's happened in a number of countries like Hungary, which Ellen and I spent 7 years in, where Viktor Orban has done an enormous amount of damage by undermining democratic institutions. And it's what the Trump Republicans have been doing in the U.S., as we know, through restricting the right to vote, gerrymandering legislative districts, packing the federal courts with judges who overturn constitutional rights, etc. But this has produced a political backlash already. Many election deniers, I think as we know, in the midterm elections, were defeated by voters who were opposed to their attacks on democracy and the Supreme Court decision overturning Roe v. Wade. In fact, the midterm elections point to a third scenario, which is the one I want to present briefly to you as the one that I hope lies ahead of us, which is to mobilize the majority, the silent majority, to reclaim equal rights through cross-partisan alliances and, above all, intensive state and local organizing. We know that the majority is fed up with polarization, rejects the political tactics that produce it. So how can the equal rights majority be mobilized to resist these polarizing tactics? Well, many practical ways. First, by working to depolarize the electoral process, protecting the nonpartisan oversight of elections. This is what began to happen last fall in the midterm elections, when voters began to do this by defeating all of the state-level election denier candidates for Secretary of State. Very important actions that were taken in the midterm elections. We can also work to reduce the influence of major donors in political campaigns by requiring full transparency, which is favored by about 70% of the majority. We could push for structural changes in election procedures, like implementing ranked choice voting, which gives multiple choices for voters and promotes moderate cross-partisan candidates. We could work to end gerrymandering, establishing nonpartisan districting commissions. We could also mobilize for other rights reforms that have cross-partisan appeal, like regulating social media by requiring algorithmic disclosure to reduce the spread of disinformation. 81% support that. Protecting the privacy of personal data, requiring transparent police guidelines and training on the use of force. 85% support that. And of course, protecting abortion rights, which has been already a major political battle and obviously will continue to do so, and major victories have been won, including in some red states, Kansas and Kentucky recently. And a big issue that cuts across partisan lines is the growing public outrage of the majority at economic inequality. Because I think based on our polling, it's possible to build a left-right coalition for economic rights. For example, in healthcare and education, where 75% and nearly half of all Republicans now call for more government spending. And finally, civic education is another major cross-partisan issue. Our polls show that notwithstanding all the cultural attacks by people like Governor Ron DeSantis and others of Florida, Americans want more government support for public schools to teach about democracy. So getting all this started means organizing at the local level. As our old congressman and then Speaker of the House of Representatives, Tip O'Neill, said, all politics are local, and this is where the action obviously is for any kind of mobilization. Local officials, like poll workers and county clerks, oversee elections. School boards and parent organizations review school curricula. Local mayors set police priorities. City councils pass or defeat gun safety laws, and every one of those locations requires mobilization to be able to push forward a restoration of equal rights. We know that many of the election officials in the battleground states, who courageously resisted Donald Trump's pressure to overturn the 2020 elections, were targeted in 2022. But intense organizing to defend them at the local level resulted in defeating all of the challengers to those who resisted Trump's pressure in last fall elections. So let me conclude by saying that, and this is an appeal to patriotism as much as it is to values, defending equal rights is a responsibility of citizenship, especially if it's the only thing that holds us together as a nation. And by protecting the shared values of freedom, the equal rights majority can reclaim the American flag. As John Lewis said about the never-ending struggle for equal rights, freedom is not a state, it is an act. It is not some enchanted garden perched high on a distant plateau where we can sit down and rest. The struggle for equal rights is the continuous action we all must take, and every generation must do its part. That's what this book is about, and thank you for letting me give you a quick summary of it. Thank you.
Is this on? Yes. A very important book. I love this book. I love it for its tone, which is telling us to stop wringing our hands and look at the problems, but look at them with the, hey, let's get going, and let's step back and appraise what the pros and cons are. It's a call to what you end with, our own responsibility and action. So it feels both mobilized and step back. Here's what we should mobilize about. And both for its informativeness and especially for the end of each chapter where he's, and now here's what we should do. This is a little prescription, and I found myself just, okay, here's the prescription for each problem. So how do we proceed? It's interesting to take in your first point. There is a silent majority, and Nork is confirming it. And I'm reminded of driving to, this was around Louisiana, and I was on a back road, and turning on Fox News, and the fact of there being a middle ground was not at my forefront. And I turned on Fox News, and it was January 15th, Martin Luther King's birthday. And there was this Fox commentator who was saying, Martin Luther King, yeah, he was a great guy, and he gave us our rights, and he fought. And Martin Luther King, he was pro-life. Martin Luther King, he was pro-guns. I thought, okay, what is he doing? In other words, there's a bending that actually, and they do these cultural blurs to bend toward this homogenous middle ground. It was actually touching to me in a curious way. Okay, we do have the same hero. We're getting there differently. So I guess what I want to also point out from the book is that while there is this silent majority, and some of it, when you look close, falls apart on each side, an important thing he begins with is from this Nork study, the Carr Center of Human Rights National Survey, was looking both at what the values that people affirm and how safe those values felt, how secure do we have them. And he found that 86% of Americans say voting rights are very important, but 32% think they're very secure. 85% say racial equality is very important. 17% say it's very secure. 85% say quality of education is important, but 17% feel it's very secure. So this is part of our call to action, right? These people believe in them, but they don't think they're very steady, they're very secure. So I've been spending the last while, as Tom well knows, in Appalachia and talking to people. And people who generally don't believe that the election was fair, they go with the election was stolen. And looking at a bunch of recent surveys, and they pretty much agree. If you look at the Washington Post, CNN, Quinnipiac, The Economist, YouGov, that altogether 60% think the election was fairly won, but 40% do not. So that's a lot of people. And I think they are not homogenous, and it bears looking at it carefully. But it's made me think that what we have to look at is what's being, I think what's coming at us to make these feel less secure. And this is very broad brush and may be obvious, but I see two things happening. First, there is, through Trump, who I think is the leader of this, a culture of suspicion that has been introduced around government, which is the enforcer of these rights that the silent majority believes in. And that, in fact, goes with a kind of a culture of disenchantment, in fact, of political life, and the whole machinery that would uphold these rights is not very, it's criticism after criticism after criticism. It's kind of just worn down the enchantment, I think, of, and what, of course, Trump is doing to substitute for the idea and the rhetoric of rights is to put forward a rhetoric of loyalty to him. Are you loyal to me? How loyal are you? And a blast of criticism if you're disloyal. That is the new lexicon that Truth Social and much of right-wing media is, it's in the air now in a way that it wasn't 10 years ago. And so I think we have to look at what's eating away at our security about these things we believe in, and to think about this culture of suspicion and disenchantment. And it actually even has a bearing on what feels true. I interviewed a man who was very down on his luck. He was had been a coal miner. He was put out of work, as most coal miners in this area have been. He was injured. He went to the doctor, was given some OxyContin to handle the pain. He got addicted to this. He lost his marriage. He lost access to his children. And he became an addict. Now he's recovering. And this man said, when Donald Trump came to my area, he said, I'm going to bring coal back. And he said, I knew he was lying, but I felt like he saw me. So if you feel seen in, and especially if you've been humiliated and feel abject, that's very powerful. And if that person is disenchanting this talk of rights that the liberals are talking about, that can be a powerful thing. So point one is to, in fact, it's kind of a cultural assault on the very idea of rights through a disenchantment and an estrangement and an enemyification of others with a different rhetoric. And the second prong of what I think of as the right-wing attack, first is culture, is on the institutions which would promote a belief in rights, and that would be the university. And I think we see it in Santos in Florida, and I am scared of that because I think they've said, okay, who's producing this rhetoric? You know, this is, who are these pollsters, you know, and who are these people talking about education? You don't need an education here. I'll give you middle-class jobs without them. That's one prong. And the other is we're going to take them over. Either we're going to diss them or take them over. So that's going to be a kind of a whole new theater of conflict. But both the government, the Democratic Party, and universities are the institutional bases, which I think the arrows are pointing at. So it's a kind of a culture and institutional attack. And speaking in very, very general terms, but I think that is what we have to bear in mind that we are up against when we turn to the end of each chapter of John's book and look at the what's to do.
Yes. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and I very much enjoyed reading the book. It touched upon, I think, as Tom noted, a lot of topics that I think about daily, and I'm constantly thinking about interventions that can address the various problems that were highlighted in the book. So I read his policy recommendations with interest and had lots of ideas for what are the experiments that need to be run here? What are different things that we can try to assess what potential impacts there can be to actually improve the situation? As Arlie noted, I think I really appreciated the tone of the book, as it was outlining all of these issues, right? Issues of democratic backsliding, issues of rights being taken away. It still had a very positive tone in terms of this doesn't have to be the future. There are ways to reverse this, and there have been moments in our history where we've been able to take a different path and move away from a path of destroying rights and taking that away. So in any case, I know I was invited because I do work on polls, and as John noted, NORC is credible, so that is definitely a credible source for these survey metrics, so I can attest to that. And he highlights that Americans, from these polls generally believe that they have more in common than many people think, and that there are bipartisan majorities that have an expansive view of rights on a whole host of issues. And that's great to see, right? That there is common ground, that we are more alike than we are different. So why is it so difficult right now to pass laws and prioritize programs that it seems like the majority generally agrees on, right, to protect these rights? And many of the policies forwarded really aren't championed by the two major parties. Like when we look at the policy recommendations, right, it's like, yes, there seems to be alignment on values across the public, but when we're looking at what policy prescriptions our two major parties are putting forth, there's a lot of misalignment there, right? It does not look like there's common ground. And so why is that happening? And I'd like to point to, one alternative perspective. I think John offers some really, accurate and poignant points around like why we're seeing this. But I want to point to some work by some fellow colleagues who do public opinion research, John Sides, Krista Sonovich, and Lynn Vavrick. So they have a recent book called The Bitter End, and they were also interested in like why is there so much opposition and polarization, and why do elections just feel so fraught right now? And they talk about calcification. Sort of thinking about kind of like how a cancer can calcify in the body. So they use that as the metaphor. And they talk about 4 features that seem quite promising as they basically surveyed hundreds of thousands of people over a period of time just in the last couple of years. And so they're noting that parties are farther apart than ever ideologically. So while there might be sort of issue areas that there's agreement, the parties themselves are very far apart. And voters within each party are more likely, more like their fellow partisans than ever. So each of the parties, there's sort of an increased homogeneity that they've observed in terms of the opinions and policy priorities that they have. And that right now, one of the big issues is that so many of our political conflicts are not based upon these sort of technocratic policy aspects. It's based on identity-inflected issues that just seem really core to who you are and like just like what you find is moral. And there is an important feature that there's near balance between people who call themselves Democrats and Republicans right now. So in that sense, the politics that we currently feel are both, it feels stuck and explosive. The stakes of election outcomes are then very high because the other side is farther away than ever, and because the balance between the parties, the victory is always within reach for each side. So when victory feels within reach, there is less of an interest to kind of take a step back and think about kind of improvements. They're more thinking about like, how can I change and fiddle with rules to win? I don't really need big changes. I just need an incremental change because I'm really close to winning. And that creates a dangerous set of incentives for the parties, right? Like they're not thinking about big important changes. They're just thinking about incremental. How can I cheat or just do a little bit of adjustment because we're really close to winning. And so that balance has created some perverse incentives from the side of parties to not really be thinking about kind of the bigger picture and the ways to protect our democracy and how we protect our electoral system. So while there is a lot of agreement on policies across the mass public, it seems like there's these misalignment within parties and the issue of the parties being really competitive with one another, right? There's also the issue when we look at policy prioritization, as I noticed, while there could be alignment, there's very different priorities in terms of what Democrats think are kind of the top issues that need to be addressed versus what Republicans feel are top issues that need to be addressed. So in that sense, like that also creates some issues too in terms of what are kind of what's the focus of each of the parties. So in the state of high calcification, what are tractable and viable solutions? I think it was great that the book opened with sort of the importance of voting. And at this point, when we're looking at voting patterns, it's quite alarming. It was great to see an uptick in voting from people of color and youth in the last elections. But if we just generally look at how different generations have been voting over time, it's been this incremental decrease, like an intercept shift, meaning that the boomers, when they were 18, they were voting at a higher rate than the current 18-year-olds. And it's been a shift downward in a linear way with every single generation. So if that pattern continues, we then basically have the youth constantly inheriting the policy priorities of those that are older. And then we also have underrepresented individuals that, we have this concern of there being the people who have to live with these policies for a longer period, like their voice is not really being heard within elections. So this expansion of rights is quite critical, and figuring out how to improve turnout and shift this trend is quite important. And the US, like when we're comparing the US against other democracies, it's not as though we can just say like, well, everyone has this problem. The US is actually the worst. Like when we're looking at advanced democracies, when we're looking at these political inequality, like just issues in terms of political inequality and turnout issues, the US is among the worst, right? So this is not a trend that like every single advanced democracy is experiencing. So there is an importance and it's quite critical to figure out how to reverse this trend. And when I think about, one of the areas that I've been, as I said, I've been thinking about interventions and how to address some of these issues. And, this might sound naive, but I started going into kind of the history of national service. And the reason why I go there is like when we actually look at sort of the beginning of programs like the Peace Corps and AmeriCorps, there was this discussion about the Gilded Youth and like what is going to happen sort of during peacetime. That during wartime, we actually had, all of these young people going out and serving their country. And what happened is they came back with a sense of civic duty, that there was this responsibility that they had to protect their community and their rights because, they literally fought in the battle line to protect these rights. Now, the solution is not to have more wars, right? We want peacetime, but in this sort of peacetime, how do we have and retain that kind of patriotism and that sense of civic responsibility, rather than if we look at the opening speeches of these are not my words, like they talk about the Gilded Youth and how they're going to be like these little egos that are just concerned about consumption, right? And we do see some of those things taking flight, like when we're seeing that turnout is really low. That's sort of a reflection of like not really being invested in what's happening in one's community. And so I started looking at national service programs. So what are the impact of these programs? Because there is actually, for now, that's not a source of political conflict, right? There isn't a let's disband all national service programs. And in fact, private entities, higher education programs, K through 12 programs, there's a lot of institutions that can actually cultivate this sense of service and trying to bring that in. And we could even sort of bypass the conflicts that we're having now regarding critical race theory and curriculum and all the things that are happening in Florida, right? It sounds at this point fairly innocuous. We're just trying to increase volunteerism and giving back to one's community. So the question is, if you encourage that kind of those types of programs, do we actually see some returns, right, in terms of civic health? And looking at programs like Teach for America, separate, you might have opinions on is that an effective way to address education inequality? Put that aside, this is more of looking at, well, what does participating in a program like that do to the participant, right? What happens to the participant? And this was some of the most kind of uplifting research that I've done, just because generally when I look at intervention-based studies, there's either a precise null effect, right? Because it's really hard to change things like civic participation, sense of justice, racial attitudes. Those are things that are really hard to change. But it was uplifting because in looking at the effects of this program, it was amazing to see how large the effects were. Right? And one could say like, well, you might just be picking up a selection bias. Like the type of people who sign up to do these programs are just different. And, there are ways to address this, right? So we ran quasi-experiments and experiments to be able to try to control and adjust for that. And after doing that, the results were still quite stunning. We saw shifts in beliefs around racial attitudes, right? They became a lot more racially tolerant. A general sense that systems were broken, but we need to be involved to fix them. It's not as though they were seeing that the political system was worse and then kind of going ostrich and going like, I'm just going to disengage. It was actually the opposite. There was higher motivation to get involved, greater political ambition among underrepresented individuals, so particularly women of color. And quite stunning, there was also, and we were able to verify this by looking at the voting records of all Teach for America participants. So you can in fact do this because you can look up whether or not a person has voted. So we matched all of those records, all 120,000 of them. And we saw that the trajectory also improved. And the effect sizes were about 5.7 to 8.6%, which is about a third of the entire gap between the voting rates of younger voters and older voters, right? So these weren't kind of piddly little effects. And the effects were larger than the effect of, say, taking an AP government or US history course and other civic education programs in K through 12, including like a charter school that is based upon civic education. So that was quite uplifting, right? Here's this thing like that we can encourage. Right? We have the Peace Corps, we can do more of it. We have AmeriCorps, we can do more of that. There are private philanthropic organizations that are kind of thinking about, can we expand service learning? Universities have service learning programs, so we can expand that. California is now doing a California Corps. So there are ways to expand this kind of investment that seems like it pays really great dividends in terms of encouraging civic health, like as we think about what needs to happen with the youth, because as John noted in his civic education chapter, it's really important for people to think about how they get involved and to have things in place that encourage people to sort of look out and think about how to be part of their community, as opposed to just, their phones, their tablets, TikTok, and things like that, probably aren't really encouraging those kinds of behaviors. And then the third point, I think there was a highlighting of the issue of underrepresentation, right? That there is sort of these extreme minorities that are kind of hijacking the system. So how do we have some better political leaders, right, that might actually start representing the majority and more moderate view that is really valuing and protecting rights, as opposed to kind of highlighting and prioritizing more fringe views? And it turns out that one I don't yet have a promising solution. All I can do is note that this is a tricky problem. So I've looked at women in particular and their underrepresentation, right? Because women make up 28% of the U.S. House, even though they make up 50.5% of the U.S. population. And when we look at why women are not running, right? There's been some discussion around women have some confidence issues. Maybe there are some things with self-doubt, sure. But if you really look at what the barriers are, it's not so much women doubting themselves and somehow thinking that they can't make a difference. It's more of the things that I think John highlights, John and his co-authors highlight in his book. Women are recognizing that running for office is an awful enterprise, right? That it's corrupt, that it involves a lot of money, and it risks privacy and safety for their families, right? Seeing things like what's happened with Paul Pelosi, that does not help women want to put their foot in, right? So some of the things that John noted, especially around sort of like money in politics and systems, and also issues around misinformation, right? It's like even someone with a perfectly clean history where there's nothing, they're still putting themselves out there because people just make things up, right? So addressing some of these other issues that are about kind of improving the environment of misinformation, improving the way campaign financing works, those are also going to have this wonderful positive spillover to encouraging underrepresented populations to run for office. So all the other things I hope, this is why I think it's really complicated and hard to try to encourage more moderate individuals for running for office. But I will stop here, but thank you for this book, John.
Only have to listen to me. But it's an honor to be able to respond to John Shattuck, a man who has distinguished himself in multiple arenas. An attorney, John has served in the senior leadership of the ACLU. A diplomat, John has led the State Department's Bureau of Human Rights, Democracy, and Labor, and represented the United States as ambassador in Prague. An educator, John has led the Central European University. A scholar, John has pushed us to think anew about the place of rights in American democracy. And I'm going to focus my remarks on the scholarly contributions that John makes in his new book. But I hope that I might also persuade John to reflect upon how the conclusions that he and his co-authors offer in Holding Together might also relate to his experience as an advocate for human rights in the world. To this end, I'm going to make just 2 points. The first involves the relationship between rights and politics, a dynamic that is central to John's book. The second involves the relationship between domestic and international conceptions of rights, between what we commonly call civil and human rights. I'll start with rights and politics. The idea that rights and politics situate in tension is familiar. After all, the power of rights derives from their capacity to circumscribe politics, to situate particular deeds in the category of the impermissible, beyond the reach of even democratic majorities. And yet, the tension between rights and politics can nonetheless be overdrawn. Affirmations of rights are effected through political processes. They are not received atop Mount Sinai. The Bill of Rights resulted not from a primordial grant, but from a self-conscious political compromise between Federalists and Anti-Federalists. One great contribution of John's analysis, I think, is to remind us that rights, in the end, derive their vitality and their relevance from the ongoing renewal of political consent. It matters, John and his co-authors show, that robust majorities of Americans support rights guarantees that are both general and generous. Still, we might ponder where precisely the politics of rights situate in relation to the familiar and foundational guarantees of rights. The question is important, for a great deal of our rights discourse and rights jurisprudence centers old texts and original intent. Hence the legal neologism that came into common use only in the 1980s, but is today ubiquitous: originalism. Our rights conversation in the United States centers the Bill of Rights and the Reconstruction-era amendments to the Constitution. The prominence of these texts exemplifies what we might call a vertical logic of rights, according to which foundational rights guarantees are enacted and then imposed across the generations upon posterity, handed down across the decades and centuries as a kind of trans-historical commitment. John, I think, commends to us a different way of thinking about the relationship between rights and politics, what we might call a horizontal logic of rights. In this approach, rights derive their vitality not from primordial commitments so much as from the ongoing consent of a political community. Thus conceived, rights situate within history, where they are an integral part of democracy's work and process. This brings me to a slightly different question. John is a diplomat as well as an attorney, and his analysis in Holding Together skirts around the originalist turn in American jurisprudence. But I wonder whether John might be blunter with us this afternoon. Has originalism gone too far? Have we become too captive to foundational texts? Should we instead think about the place of rights in our society in terms that Thomas Jefferson might perhaps have preferred, as a process of ongoing creation and recreation, a process that must be enacted through politics? In order to realize the promise of the American rights consensus that John and his co-authors describe, do we need to rethink how we understand the sources of rights and the institutional processes that ensure their vindication? Do we, in other words, need to recalibrate the balance between rights and politics in American life in favor of politics? Let me now turn to my second point, which concerns scale. Holding Together characterizes rights as a kind of guardrail for politics, specifically as a guardrail for American politics. Here, the book's great accomplishment is twofold. John and his co-authors formulate a slew of wise recommendations that would reinvigorate Americans' common rights, our right to vote, to the law's equal protection, to privacy, and so on. John and his co-authors also demonstrate, with robust evidence, that strong majorities of Americans favor the solutions that they advocate. Still, I hope that John won't object to my reflecting on a theme whose absence from the book is conspicuous in the context of John's career. This is the cause of global or international rights, a cause for which John has done vital and valiant work, including as the nation's senior-most human rights diplomat under President Clinton. I am drawn to wonder, what should we make of John and his co-authors' decision to center American rights, what we usually call civil rights, rather than global or human rights? Should an argument be inferred about the superior viability or even the preferability of civil rights in the domestic frame to more universal conceptions of human rights that apply everywhere in theory, but which are in practice vindicated hardly anywhere? On this point, I am reminded of a legal controversy from the early post-war years, the case of Sei Fuji. An immigrant from Japan, Fuji contested California's confiscation of his property during World War II. Himself an attorney, Fuji argued that the state's Alien Property Act violated the Charter of the United Nations. Remarkably, a California appellate court actually upheld Fuji's claim, establishing the supremacy of the United Nations Charter over California law. But only for a fleeting moment. The California Supreme Court quickly reversed the Fuji decision in 1952, affirming that the United Nations Charter took no precedence over state law. But the story does not end here. The California Supreme Court nonetheless found in favor of the plaintiff, Sei Fuji, reasoning that California's confiscation had violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. The decision, I think, is revealing. Sei Fuji portended a grand divergence that would unfold over the decades to come. Universal guarantees of rights, including those affected within the 1948 Universal Declaration, mostly proved a dead letter. But rights affected by nation-states sometimes proved transformative. The United States, in the decades after Sei Fuji, experienced a rights revolution, whose overarching logic would be the incorporation of the Bill of Rights against the states via the 14th Amendment. The flourishing of rights in America, as a result, would contrast with the moribund predicament of human rights elsewhere. Worldwide, billions of people today lack meaningful rights, but civil rights in America have reproduced with such promiscuity that today even firearms possess them. The contrast between the ascent of rights in the domestic arena and their descent worldwide prompts a question that may unsettle my fellow academics. To posit the superior performance of nation-scaled solutions risks celebrating an institution, the nation-state, that many of us consider to be an anachronism or worse. Having forgotten what Adam Smith once taught us about the natural bounds of human affection, we academics favor general solutions, not those affected in particular time and space. Universals, we might say, are the opiate of the intellectuals. Our preoccupation with them orients us towards global solutions, such as the 1948 Declaration. Reading Holding Together, it is nonetheless tempting to interpret John's conclusions as a robust defense of the particular over the general, even of the national over the global. John, we should remember, has worked for rights in the nation-state and in the world. He has served as an important, prominent leader of the ACLU and as a senior human rights diplomat. He knows the world of human rights and he knows the world of civil rights. That given, it warrants our attention, I think, that John has offered us a robust and even hopeful case for civil rights as the basis upon which our democracy might be renewed. Should we conclude that John is, in the end, more optimistic about the project of civil rights in the United States than he is about the project of human rights in the world? Should we conclude that the best hope for rights situates not in the pursuit of human rights, a purpose that our disintegrating international order makes improbable, but in a recommitment to the realization of civil rights at the national or territorial scale within liberal democracies? Should we conclude that the best contribution that Americans can today make to the quest for rights, to the quest for freedom and equality, is to pursue the rehabilitation of their own civil rights and to thereby make their own democracy a more exemplary community of fate? It is a testament, I think, to John Shattuck's accomplishment in holding together and, no less important, in a long and distinguished career of public service that he pushes us to ponder such important and urgent questions.
And then we'll open the floor for questions.
Let me stay seated just as everyone else is here so that we don't, let me make also sure. Is that on? No. Is it on now? Yes, very good. Yeah. Well, thank you all. Thank you, Tom, for moderating. I don't know whether moderation was needed here. Perhaps so. And to all of you, Arlie, Cecilia, Daniel, there are so many ideas out there, and they're all extremely valuable. I want to make a quick comment on each of you, if I may. Not on everything you've said, but on some particulars. Arlie, what you said about universities is so critical, and this is about to become the front lines of the struggle for human rights universally as well as domestically. I say universally because I've just recently been in Hungary, where I defended the academic freedom of a university that ended up being forced out of Hungary by the Prime Minister of Hungary, Viktor Orban. And so these issues are very real. But most importantly, and this is a challenge for the universities, if we are to indeed continue to be able to promote freedom and discourse and democracy, we need pluralism in universities. And I fear that that may be a waning aspect of universities. And I find myself sometimes allied with, shall we say, conservative critics of universities for that very reason. I love Daniel's phrase, universals are the opiate of intellectuals. Thank you very much. That was a wonderful. But in all seriousness, I think the battleground the battle will be lost quite quickly if the universities are unable to reflect a kind of diversity of opinion. This is not a comment on Berkeley. I have no sense of Berkeley, but I know the two universities I'm associated with, Harvard and Tufts University, are both struggling with this issue, very much so. So anyway, thank you for bringing that up. There are many other things we could discuss as well, Arlie, in terms of the richness of contribution that you've made over many years, and you will in your new book, I know, on what it is that creates this disenchantment and culture of shaming and fear that really drives people apart, and the role that perhaps the very concept of rights may play in that area. So that's one comment, but thank you above all, Arlie, for your work. Cecilia, I just want to comment on one. That was a wonderful laying out of various aspects of why we don't have common ground on policies and politics today, and your your second set of comments about the origins of civic responsibility and the kind of value that national service organizations can play in this respect. But I just want to specifically refer to three ways in which I think we can break down through policies, and they are quite popular and they're already being used in a number of states and locations, break down this polarization. The first is what's called ranked choice voting. I mentioned it very briefly in my remarks. But ranked choice voting it basically gives voters a range of choices that they can, rank literally the various candidates who are up for office, and then the candidates with the most cumulative votes, or the candidate with the most cumulative votes is going to be the candidate elected, and inevitably that will be a candidate who is more toward the center or more moderate than someone who's going to get all the people on the left or all the people on the right. And this is being used in several places, in Alaska, in Maine, and there's been a remarkable amount of practical success in the value of ranked choice voting. I think one of the reasons that Sarah Palin is not now representing Alaska in the Congress is ranked choice voting. People chose a much more moderate, but also person of color and a person of indigenous background to represent them. There's also the primary system that we use now in developing candidates for parties is a disaster because it inevitably pushes in an early stage of the election process toward the extreme. So it's the extreme candidate who ends up being nominated. And I think if we were to, I wouldn't just reform the primary system, I would abolish it. I don't see any reason why we need it. There need to be ways of selecting candidates other than this extremist approach. And then finally, I would say that partisan gerrymandering is another aspect of the kind of extreme, or at least highly partisan people that we now see in public office. Daniel, there's so much that I could say, but I will only say a few brief things. One comment, because you've provoked me, obviously, very much to indicate why it is I'm focusing so much on the domestic situation when much of my career has been international. There's a very simple answer for that, I think, actually, which is this is where the crisis is. I also happen to be, and Ellen and I think very much together on these subjects. I'm an American who's very concerned about the condition of not just rights, but democracy generally in the state of freedom in our own country. So, you know, going abroad and focusing on these issues is all fine and dandy, but when the country is on fire, you want to do something to try to understand how it might put the fire out. Anyway, that's a very practical answer, I think. But the more general point that I would make in response to your very provocative analysis about has originalism gone too far, and do we need to rebalance the relationship between politics and rights more in favor, or generally more toward the politics side? Absolutely, the answer is very clear, and I think the reason the Fuji case went where it went, and the reason why rights, in a sense, flourished following that period, as you described, is because rights ended up having more of a political base because they were based on the sovereignty and the relationship of individuals within a country where there was a government and a sovereign state. And when you're dealing with international human rights, there is almost no enforcement mechanism, as we know. And I certainly learned this in my own work, and to the extent that any enforcement ever comes to bear, it's usually a collection of sovereign states that are able to enforce. The war in Bosnia was ended in the Dayton peace agreements, imperfect as those were, with the active involvement of the United States and its European allies. The UN was distantly involved, but there was very much of a diplomacy backed by force, and NATO actually happened to be the force at that time. What's happening in Ukraine is another very powerful example of what I meant. So thank you for that very provocative and very useful analysis. So let me stop at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me open the floor for questions. Carla. I'm sorry. Is it, sir?
I would like to ask about the media. We've talked a lot about public institutions and political institutions, but John or anyone else, would you like to comment on whether it would be a good idea to bring back the fairness doctrine?
Well, let me get the ball rolling on that. Thank you, Carla. And I think the issue of media is certainly the fairness doctrine is symptomatic of the issue that needs to be addressed with media, but it's the transformative nature of media these days and the entirely different landscape that we're dealing with from, only 10 years ago. I mean, the rise, obviously, of social media, and now, of course, the whole artificial intelligence implications for media development. Anyway, I'm not here to comment on all of that, but I think that the crisis of media and rights, to be very precise, is a crisis of facts and truth. And how do we elicit and I don't think we can return to a halcyon day when facts and truth were mediated by a few major, sort of truth sayers who were the Solons of the newspaper world. But on the other hand, we do need to find a way to deal with that. Now, whether returning to the fairness doctrine would be a way to do that, I suppose it might, but it would be insufficient. It would clearly be a possibility that fairness, i.e., give people an opportunity to respond to comments, particularly in the political arena, that have been made about them. But I think that we also need algorithmic transparency so that we have some idea of where and how this this information that's being purveyed out into the social media and greatly magnified, what the basis for the decisions are that are made. And my polling data show that people very strongly favor that. So, we've written a lot about media, but it's a complex set of topics. The fairness doctrine is one of them, that's for sure. I don't know whether anybody else would like to comment on that.
That was based on the old technology of broadcast, which allowed regulation because it was the public airwaves. And now that we have new tech platforms for our conversations and our information, the fairness doctrine is not the vehicle that's going to work because there's no real broadcast is not where the action is, frankly. Sorry about that, my TV colleagues. So I think the debate is on the new version of that, which is, are the social media and other media that are self-identified and self-generated, are they utilities that have no that are completely neutral, or are they publishing platforms that are already exerting editing capacities in order to benefit from their advertising, and their algorithms are edited for certain corporate reasons? So that's really where I think the action is, as well as civic education to help with media literacy, helping young people determine what is worthy and what is just entertainment.
Show of hands, we all lose, by California state law, we all lose civil rights on New Year's Eve every year. Okay, so by California state law, we all get 2 silver bullets a year, 2 chances at $10,000 small claims court, and then we lose those on New Year's. So every year on New Year's, I file 2 lawsuits against John Doe with a court date a month out. And so when January 1 comes around and everyone just lost 2, I retain those 2 and I get the new 2, so I have 4. I'm guessing nobody does this because every year I don't see anybody but me there. So this is about our Professor Laqueur documentary, Hot Coffee. The corporations got together to brainwash us not to sue. That's a blunt. Do you know the movie? No. Oh, nobody knows the movie. Oh my God.
All right, David.
We're screwed.
I very much want to believe in the capacity of this society to successfully carry out the plan that John outlined and that we've been discussing here. I very, very much want to believe in it. But there are some obstacles to my belief, and I want to acknowledge one source of gloom, and perhaps I can be talked out of this. I'm a little more gloomy about it than John is because of the historic tension, if not contradiction, between a capacity for egalitarian policies and social democracy on the one hand, and demographic diversity on the other. The social democratic regimes of Northwestern Europe were created by some of the most demographically homogeneous societies in the entire industrialized world. Social democracy makes the most progress in the United States in the period between the 1930s and about 1970, when there's no immigration, and the foreign-born population of the United States in 1970 is the lowest in all of American history. It's then that we seem to have the social capability to create rights, to be able to support rights. So my concern is that if there is this tension, and we're massively committed to the diversity that we have, and we're not going to roll back immigration, how much of a barrier is this? I mean, isn't there a demographic context in which we should be addressing the prospects for carrying out John's plan?
Well, just a quick comment, David. Thank you. The sort of social democratic, or should we say, economic rights that you're referring to, are only part of the picture. They're certainly not the principal part of the picture that I'm talking about in the book, and the areas of agreement. Although it's certainly true that recently Americans have shown, partly as a result of the pandemic, a greater interest in having public support, to wit, government support, taxpayer-paid support for various economic rights, particularly education, medical care, and the environment is increasingly popular. It's not being translated into practical policies for all the reasons that we're talking about here in terms of the polarization. But immigration. I was again very remarkably surprised by what we found in the polling data about immigration. Now, of course, this is all at a very high level, rather than a level of are there people going to come and take your jobs away? But by and large, Americans had a relatively liberal perspective on the value of immigration and diversity and new people coming into the country. Also, there are economic values in having new people come into the country. We certainly know the economic needs of various aspects of the workforce, which are not being fulfilled by domestic workers at the moment. So there are conservative voices that are interested in more immigration, but I wouldn't use the social democracies of Northern Europe as a point of comparison here. We're a very different society. We're all the way down the line toward a high degree of diversity. There's a lot of reaction against that. That's a lot of what I'm writing about, and also what Arlie and much of her work is about, the negative reaction to diversity. But we're moving ahead, and the message in my book is that about 70% want to stick with this diverse society that we have.
Sure. I acknowledge that there are tensions that come from diversity. If we look at some research around what are the immediate impacts of diversity, we do see that there can be a breakdown in public trust. We see in the book how important trust is in terms of building a democratic society. But then when we look sort of in the long term, we do see that, it doesn't necessarily have to stay that way. And right now, it does seem that immigration issues are very fraught, and it comes up in a lot of political debates. And when we've looked at immigration attitudes to see if we are actually seeing kind of a greater backlash and more anti-immigrant sentiment, because it seems like there is when we look at the news. There's actually been very little movement, maybe no movement, among those who identify as Republican. So they've identify as Republican. So their views on immigration actually haven't changed. What has changed are Democrats. They are now more pro-immigration. So where there is change is actually in the direction of supporting more immigrants, if we look kind of overall, because there's been no change in the Republican views, if we just look at the mass public, right? Separate from what the elites are saying, the political elites. If we're just looking at those who identify as Republicans versus Democrats, what is kind of more sobering is it isn't a reality that there's now more anti-immigrant sentiment, even though it seems that way. Because for the most part, all the change is actually happening on the Democrats, where they're now wanting kind of a more open society and kind of improved pathways for kind of getting permanent residency and getting the undocumenteds actually to actually have a green card and then be part of formal society. So some good news, hopefully, for the gloom. Yeah.
It's a really, really important point, but I'm going to, okay, is it working now? But I'm going to push back a little bit at the historical analogy. I am absolutely prepared to concede that there's a sort of pattern of, positive, alignment between the Gini coefficient and demographic diversity. I think that those two variables do sort of positively correlate if you look at the experience of Western Europe. But socioeconomic egalitarianism is not synonymous with rights observation or rights exaltation. On the contrary, when you look at sort of the mid-century European welfare state as sort of the ideal type of the social democratic experiment, I'm not convinced that it is characterized by a particular prioritization of rights as a basis for politics. So I just don't buy the premise that rights exist in particular tension with demographic diversity. I would buy the premise that socioeconomic egalitarianism situates in tension with demographic diversity, but I think that those are different issues.
One comment on this. One area in the book in which the issue of human rights and civic rights come together. I'm sorry. The one place in the book in which human rights, international rights, and the UN Declaration, especially the refugee issues, come together with civic rights seems to be in your section on immigration. And your recommendations are all on the point of civil rights, that is to say, changing the U.S. system of asylum, adjudicating asylums. So you don't really address the question that Daniel raised. You sort of take that as a given of the civil rights regime in America.
Thank you, Tom. I think it's true that when we focus on immigration in this book, nobody out here has read the book with a few exceptions, I think, so I could summarize for you this chapter as well summarized by Tom. It focuses on what effectively are the rights of refugees and those coming into the country who are, many of them claiming that they're fleeing various forms of persecution or various forms of violence, or indeed increasingly various forms of just total instability of society. And the international asylum laws, which have been incorporated into the United States, and you're absolutely right, Tom, that's what we focus on in the chapter. The international asylum laws are woefully inadequate for dealing with the realities of people fleeing from not only well-founded fear of persecution, which is literally the term in the International Refugee Convention, but also from all these other crises of our time, probably the major one of which in the future is going to be climate change. And we don't give asylum to people for climate change. Should we? This is a debate, this is a question. But that's where the question of rights comes in. The issue of whether and how many people should be allowed to come in under immigration status more generally is indeed a political question. I would recognize it as such. It's not that you don't have a right necessarily to come into the United States unless you can prove that you are seeking asylum and you have a well-founded basis for that, for getting asylum. And as I say, the law on asylum it has not kept up with the realities of the tumult in the world that is causing people to flee and come not only to the United States, but to other advanced societies. Europe has exactly the same problems that we do in that way. Yes.
Sorry, I don't know your name. Yourself.
Oh, hi. Firstly, thank you so much for being here. This is really such a privilege. Mr. Shattuck, many of the interventions that you mentioned to minimize political polarization were state-led. They were big policy changes. And I'm curious, does this imply that polarization is often the result of factors beyond our immediate control? And similarly, and this might be too optimistic, but what is the responsibility of the individual to combat their anti-rights attitudes?
It is a good question, a very good question. And indeed, the issue of polarization is as much, and I really want to turn to Arlie to get her thoughts on this as well. The issue of polarization is so multidimensional. There are institutional reasons for it, the distrust of institutions that I've mentioned, and also the erosion or calcification of institutions, as Cecilia was indicating, which is making them less effective and they're therefore less trustworthy. But also just the psychological feelings that people have. I think Cecilia made a very good comment on this, the fact that political parties each feel that they're close to winning, and therefore, in a sense, perversely, they don't want to do anything together with the other party because they might win. And they're, in terms of numbers, both in terms of polling numbers, it's roughly equal, although the Democrats seem to have a demographic edge in many parts of the country. So it is, in the end, there are individual responsibilities, I suppose, in terms of, and this gets to our chapter on civic education. Because we really no longer teach what, when I was in school, and anybody else here who has white hair in the audience would have at the same time, even some of you without white hair, we used to take civics, and civics you were taught about what is the essence of democracy. The essence of democracy is compromise. It's an alternative to violent conflict. That's really what ultimately democracy is. It's not only, of course, representation by groups, by individuals of larger groups, and the right to vote and all the rest. But when you get into the actual functioning of democracy in the Congress or in a state legislature, or even in a court, where courts have to trade back and forth if it's a multiple court, if there are multiple judges in a court, it's all about compromise. We don't learn this anymore. It's not taught in schools, and people are demanding that it be taught, that there be more civic education, that we return to this. And I'm very happy to say that in the most recent education bill that went through the last Congress at the very end of the last session, there was a significant increase in funding for state educational teaching in the areas of history and civics more generally, so that we're going to see more of this in the public schools. That, of course, is triggering another culture debate that you're seeing, starting in Florida, where Governor Ron DeSantis is determined, as I said, with my destructive minority, to polarize and to separate it by essentially saying, no, we're going to teach this, we don't want anything about race, or we don't want particular aspects of racial discussion in schools, et cetera. So the polarization is multidimensional. It does indeed relate to one's individual perspective as well as these more structural issues.
Arlie, could you make a comment?
This will support the certain native optimism I sense in you, John. There is something, speaking of individual initiatives, there is something called the Bridge Alliance that has some 70 different civic startups of people worried about how divided we are, and there are groups that have names like Hi from the Other Side, Living Room Conversations, and it's just neighbors, people who are bothered by this, and who do represent, I think, kind of the best of America. I'll tell you a very personal story. The last time I went down to Louisiana, there was a young man who came with me who was interested in starting an organization, which he then went and did, starting with some of the people that I wrote about and came to know. And it's called the American Education Experiment. And what it does is get high school seniors in southern towns to get to know, through Google Chat, high school seniors in the north. So south to north, coastal to inland, inland to coast. And it ends with a 2-week visit each way. And they don't talk politics to start with. Talk about sports, what's going on in your town. And as being very personal, I got a letter after Strangers in Their Own Land from a Southern Baptist evangelical minister from Texas. I thought, okay, open the letter. Well, it said, imagine my surprise to find some good news from of all places, Berkeley, California. And then he said, I'm descended from John Calhoun, and there are many things the Republican Party I don't agree with, but I am, Republican and so on. And so I wrote him back, dear Reverend Glenn, and signed it, your friend from Berkeley, California. And we began a friendship. And he is now a member of the board of this American Educational Exchange Project. And he's been more active than anyone, getting his Texas high school students to Boston, Massachusetts. So I think there is a civic spirit in America, and it doesn't get much press, and I think it's what you're pressing for.
I think that's very much the sort of thing that you're talking about. I mean, it's a bit like your sort of America and these different groups that you've been engaged with, huh?
Absolutely. When we look at things like, now we're exploring those who have been recruiting students right out of high school with their gap year, encouraging them to do immersion programs, looking at programs also in Ethiopia where the students are assigned to families in communities of a different ethnic group, just to see what happens when you have these host family exchanges. And the studies that I've been talking about aren't just in the U.S. I've been doing them in India, Australia, and Mexico, among other places. And like I said, now starting in Ethiopia. And you see that when there's this sort of, and we've seen this with laboratory studies, and now what I'm doing is sort of field studies. You take a lab study and you kind of expand it to the field and the field is messier than in a laboratory. What do you see there? But when there is sort of a friendship potential, which I think is what Arlie is referencing with, she's literally signed the letter, your friend, right? When there's this friendship potential that's created between people who have very different life circumstances, different histories. There's a lot of good that comes from that, right? So we don't want to just kind of bring people together. As I noted before, diversity initially can actually kind of degrade trust. And that's because these are sort of surface kind of interactions. What you need are the deeper interactions. And so that's why over time, you can go from kind of mistrust to actually something that's a lot richer. And so the more we can do sort of in society to kind of encourage this friendship potential between groups that don't otherwise necessarily interact, good can come from that in very meaningful ways.
Wonder if I might ask a question as chair. I think one of you, maybe John, talked about the issue of inequality. Talking about the issue of inequality. And historically, economic rights and social rights have been separated from political rights, civil rights. The French constitutions that happened, the UN and so forth. So I would like to hear all of you reflect on this question of the status of economic rights. On the one hand, I think it's been suggested that that economic inequality makes effective political life and democracy very difficult. So doing something about economic inequality seems to be a precondition for an effective democracy. Be one version. The other version is that actually some version of economic equality is in itself a right, which ought to be sought and political. So I wonder if you could talk about economic rights both as a precondition for democracy, as you mentioned, and as in itself a civil right per se. That might give you all a chance to speak to each other on topics that.
I'm going to take Tom's question and shamelessly turn it into a question for Arlie. But maybe give a little bit of a preview, not of her answer, because it's her answer, of course, but rather of my own perspective on this subject. Historically, the United States has been allergic to the concept of economic rights. Economic rights have generally been looked at ever since, particularly putting this in terms of what Daniel was asking or suggesting, the balance between rights and politics, since the Reagan era, and since the supremacy of liberal economic theory, liberal with a small l, very much so, which is essentially that the market governs and that regulation only gets in the way of economic freedom, and therefore economic freedom is much more important than economic rights that any person might have to have compensatory treatment, to be able to afford medical care or education or what have you. So all of that is part of our history. That is a critical part of it. What I found in the book and the findings in the book is that that's being abandoned, that split. And I think we've seen, really, frankly, and I give both Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump some degree of credit for this on both sides. And I think they've demonstrated the possibility of finding a cross-partisan, I'd hardly call it bipartisan, outrage at economic inequality. Now, Trump hardly is to be equated with Bernie Sanders, so don't get me wrong here in that sense. And not only that, but Trump's approach toward this is really, I think, very disingenuous, because by and large his public policies have supported people at the top of the economic sphere. On the other hand, he plays to, and this is my question to Arlie, he plays to the disenchantment and anger of large parts of the population on the right who are economically disadvantaged. And therefore, I think there is a possibility for bridging the gap between the left and the right on this issue of economic inequality. So that's my preview. The question is that true? What do you think, Arlie?
It's hard. I think if we look at who is on the right, they are a rural, blue-collar, downwardly mobile economically, okay? And the leaders of the right in those areas are kind of the elite of the left behind. So they're lower middle class sort of town leaders who really want to make things better in their downwardly mobile area. And they're looking through their newspapers, through the media, at the upwardly mobile kind of Silicon Valley kind of prosperous left. And they think, what are you talking about? Now you want to tax me more heavily to redistribute because it's fair and I'm not buying it. That's what they're saying. And so I'm going to call you a socialist and a communist and try and shame you. And in their personal lives, they're extremely shamed to be to get food stamps. Well, I shopped at another store so my neighbors wouldn't see, when I lost my job, or she's just on welfare, and those blacks are on welfare. So if you look at distribution, and one part of it is the government helping poor people, it's saturated in shame and disregard. And so we have to look at how these things feel on the right before we say, hey, it's a crossover issue.
Just, I guess my question, especially for political scientists, would be: is inequality detrimental to democracy, or do we need to do something? Does John need to spend more attention for hold together and create more democracy? Do we need to produce more equality, economic equality?
Short answer is yes. Short answer is yes. So have looked at just done some research around kind of the effects of not only inequality but perceptions of inequality too, right? So like separate from actual, just like your perceived inequality, and that's been linked to kind of being more risk tolerant, meaning things like taking part in conflict. There's more willingness to engage in political violence, right? So there's an old classic book, Why Men Rebel. And the whole story about that is when you feel left behind and when there is an acute sense of inequality, that kind of creates the seeds for more political violence. So there's real risks in terms of the health of a democracy when there's an acute sense of deprivation, relative deprivation. And then in the U.S., I think, as Arlie mentioned, like it's really hard because on top of this, I think there's just a general human tendency, separate from whether you're an American or not, just what the effects of feeling left behind does to just a person, like any person, regardless of culture. But then in this society, we have this history of meritocracy, that you're supposed to pull yourself up from your bootstraps. And in terms of any kind of social safety net, there's been this linkage of kind of the sense of the undeserving poor. And so when you have those things combined, it creates a much more difficult kind of set of like, how do you start having government be involved in ways to address economic inequality when there's also this very entrenched view that social safety nets those are there to try to address inequality, right? Like that's something that's being rejected by the very people that would benefit from those programs, right? And so there's a sense of how do we do this when you're very angry that you're feeling left behind, which is a very human thing that we see it universally, but that at least in this society, because of the history of like how we're supposed, like how the social safety net is viewed, and this sense of meritocracy that you're supposed to do it on your own, hard work, all of that is supposed to that's the way that you're supposed to succeed. It then makes it hard to then implement those policies that can start addressing this. So we're in kind of a quagmire, at least in this environment.
This is not my special subject, but a couple of reflections. First, if we go back to Marx, right, we are reminded that capitalism and socialism are not just different kinds of economic systems. They're also different kinds of political systems. So it's important to remember that sort of economic arrangements also involve considerations of political power that cannot be disentangled. I think it's also important to remember as we contemplate the question of how the United States might cultivate a higher degree of economic egalitarianism, to remember that so much of this country's prosperity and success has been predicated upon a high level of economic liberty. Economic liberty, has differentiated this country, not just from, sort of the Soviet antithesis during the Cold War, but also from, West European social democratic economies that have struggled to maintain over the long haul the high rates of economic growth that have been characteristic of the U.S. economy. And I think, sort of to build upon a point that Arlie made, a relatively, robust level of economic liberty is also perhaps important for the psychic well-being of workers. The challenge, I think, for public policy is to figure out how do you reconcile a commitment to economic liberty with an expanded level of economic equality. Because I'm a sort of historian who favors inductive methods, I would say let's look at the world and see what the exemplary cases are. The Scandinavian model, I think, is a good example of how to reconcile a higher degree of economic egalitarianism with the preservation of a robust level of economic liberty.
Look, I think it's 6. We need to thank this brilliant panel. John, thank you for the provocation. Arlie, Cecilia, Daniel, thank you.